Okay, let's get started with this podcast for Chapter 14. This material on this podcast and the rest of the podcasts will be covered in the last exam, the third exam. Now, a lot of you have had a course in economics to get into the pharmacy curriculum, but we're going to go over briefly some of the basic economic principles affecting your healthcare. There are 20 pages of textbook that we're addressing with this podcast, 27 slides, and 4 IRATs we will cover as part of this podcast. Be advised that there's several tables on this particular chapter that you should take a look at. First of all, table 14.1 is an illustration of the law of diminishing marginal return or utility. Table 14.2 is the demand schedule for pizzas. And table 14.3 is factors that affect the demand for healthcare services, and 14.5 factors that affect the supply for healthcare services. So all of those figures are important to take a look at. In this chapter, we have 4 objectives that we'll be covering as we go through the podcast. There are economic concepts in individual consumer decision-making in the market. You need to know that economics is a study of how individuals and societies allocate their limited resources in attempts to satisfy their unlimited wants. It tries to answer 3 questions. What shall we produce with society's limited resources? How shall the resources be used in production? And who shall receive the resulting goods and services? The 2 most important concepts in economics are supply and demand, which interact to determine the market prices for commodities, which are goods and services. Utility is the economic term for satisfaction obtained from the consumption of a good or service. It is assumed that people want to maximize their utility within resource constraints. 3 basic resources: land, labor, and capital. Capital meaning money and physical resources. Bear in mind that cost is proportional to constraints. Value is determined by marginal utility, the satisfaction obtained from receiving one or more of a good or service. Marginal utility depends on the personal desire for one more unit of a good or service. There is the law of diminishing marginal utility, which is the satisfaction received by obtaining one more unit of a good, which declines as one consumes more of it. So, for example, the example often given is if you buy a pizza, the first piece of pizza you eat, usually you get very much satisfaction. But as you eat more and more pieces of that pizza, your satisfaction goes down. It declines. So from this particular slide, I need you to prepare for an IRAT. You need to know that the law of diminishing marginal utility means that as more of a commodity is assumed, the total utility will rise, but at a declining rate. So it does go up a little, but at a declining rate. Now, the law of demand. The law of demand is the quantity demanded of a commodity is inversely proportional to its price. The higher the price, the less of it one wants. Demand is not synonymous with need or want. A demand schedule shows the various amounts of a commodity that consumers are willing and able to purchase at a set of possible prices over a specified period of time. Here you see a demand curve on the right. A demand curve is a graphical representation of a demand schedule with a price you see there on the y-axis going from 6 to 14, plotted against the y-axis, and on the quantity demanded is on the x-axis you can see there from 16 to 80. As the price goes down, the quantity demand goes up. As the price goes up, the quantity demand goes down. And so you're going up and down that curve. You must distinguish between the terms change in quantity demand and change in demand. Continuing this on the next slide, a change in quantity demand moves along the demand curve. So you go here from point A to point B, where the quantity changes from, you can see here, from 1 to 2 on this on the quantity axis. A change in demand is when the entire curve shifts. That means it goes from D to D1, you can see here. Now on this particular slide, I have an IRAT that you should ready yourself for. Make a note on your outline. That is, a rightward shift in the demand curve for a commodity necessarily means that the price of the complementary goods has increased. Again, a rightward shift, like you see on the bottom diagram here, in the demand curve for a commodity necessarily means that the price of complementary goods has increased. So like if the demand for coffee goes up, you would also suspect that the price for complementary goods like tea would go up. Factors that change demand: prices of related goods, money income of the consumer, number of consumers in the market, the attitudes, tastes, and preferences of the consumer, and consumer expectations with respect to future prices and incomes. So if you suspect that the price for a new television set is going to go down in the coming months, you might wait off on buying that particular product. There are substitutes. It's the price of one good is directly related to the demand for another. For example, beef and chicken, coffee and tea. Complements: the price of one good is inversely related to the demand of another. So example, printers and ink cartridges are complements. Superior goods are normal. Demand increases for a good as the income rises. For example, luxury cars, second homes, vacation homes. Inferior goods, demand decreases for a good as income rises. So, for example, used cars and store brands. Continuing on with the law of demand. The number of consumers in the market. We were talking about with the law of demand, attracting new customers to the same product. An example, direct-to-consumer advertising or rebranding. Lanaten for hypertension and minoxidil for baldness. So Lanaten and minoxidil are actually the same chemical, just different names. One is marketed for hypertension and the other is for baldness. Attitudes, tastes, and preferences of the consumer. As attitudes, tastes, and preferences change, products are changed or remarketed to fit or lose market share. An example, NyQuil as a cold medicine takes advantage of its drowsiness side effect to market as cold medicine for bedtime. So a lot of people with colds having trouble falling asleep turn to NyQuil. Consumer expectations with respect to future prices and incomes. Consumers expect prices to go up or down, so they buy now or later. Consumers expect their income to go up or down, so they buy more or less. Examples, housing prices. So buy a house now, expect income to go up, so buy a bigger house. All depends on consumer expectations. Here you switch to the law of supply. We talked about demand, now we're talking about supply. The law of supply is the price that individuals are willing to pay for a product increases, more of the product will be supplied. Supply, like demand, has a schedule, which can be depicted like the diagram on the right as a curve. A supply schedule shows the quantity of a commodity that sellers are willing to supply at a given price. You must distinguish, like you did with the law of demand, between the terms change in quantity supplied and change in supply. So again, we look at this further on the next slide. The change in the quantity supplied moves along the supply curve. So you go from A to B or B to A. And with the diagram below, you see a change in supply where the entire curve shifts. So you go from 2 to 1. Now on this particular slide, we also have another IRAT that I want you to prepare for. You might want to put a note on your outline. In general, supply curves slope upward and to the right. You can see this on the upper diagram from A to B, because as rising prices motivate producers to offer more units for sale. So as the price goes up, as prices for a product or a service go up, it motivates producers to offer more units for sale. And that's why you see that supply curve sloping upward and to the right. Okay, moving on. Factors that change supply, techniques of production, including technology, the number of sellers in the market, resources like material and wages, prices for related goods, and sellers' expectations. Now looking more closely under the law of supply, and there's more of this in the textbook. First is techniques of production. When technology advances, the cost of production usually goes down. Examples, equipment, supplies, methods of production, or management techniques. You see this in the auto industry with the advent of robots. So the cost of production, the labor costs are going down. The number of sellers in the market, more producers create more output. As the number of sellers increases, supply increases. Resources costs, as costs increase or decrease, sellers make more or less profit and therefore have less or more incentive to produce. Example, lower fertilizer costs allow farmers to plant more land and produce more crops. Looking further into the prices for related groups, there are substitute products and their joint products. Keep in mind this is different from the law of demand. So looking at substitute products here, products that can be produced with the same or similar inputs. If there are two products made with essentially the same inputs, one will produce more of that, which will create more profit. Goods that are almost always produced together are, for example, beef and leather. An increase in the price of beef will induce more production, and hence more leather will be produced as well. There are the seller's expectations in this market. If sellers expect prices to increase in the near future, they may produce more now in preparation or withhold production later. For example, farmers timing sales to obtain favorable prices, hence maximizing profit. On this next slide is a very important concept of the equilibrium price. Here you're bringing the supply curve in with the demand curve. The price system is the interaction of the supply and demand. It determines how economic resources are allocated. Also, this is an important bullet. The market equilibrium price is that price where the demand curve and the supply curve intersect. Moving on to elasticity of demand. Elasticity measures the responsiveness of consumer demands to a change in price. Producers try to maximize the revenue. Price times quantity is equal to revenue. Depending on the elasticity of a product, sellers can maximize revenue by either increasing or decreasing the price. Moving on to the three types of elasticity of demand, there's elastic, inelastic, and unitary, and we'll discuss all three in turn. First of all is elastic demand. Demand is elastic if an increase in price causes the quantity demanded to decrease enough to result in a decrease in total revenue. So an increase in price causes the quantity and the total revenue to go down. And from that, we have an IRAT. So make a note on your outline. Which of the following illustrates a move along a demand curve? That would be Diane buys fewer lobsters because the price of lobsters has increased. So with the increase in price of lobsters, Diane buys fewer lobsters, and as you see from this slide, the total revenue for the person making the lobsters available goes down. Inelastic demand. Demand is inelastic if the increase in price does not result in a sufficient decrease in quantity demanded to prevent a decrease in revenue. So price increases and revenue increases. A good example of that would be gasoline for cars. If the price of gasoline goes up, revenue continues to go up. People don't change their habits for something that they really have to have. Then there's unitary demand. The demand is unitary if the total revenue is unchanged regardless of changes in price. It's not present in the real world. We won't talk about that too much. Determinants of elasticity of demand, the availability of substitutes. The more substitutes for a product, the more elastic the demand is. So an example would be brands of sugar. The price is relative to income. A purchase that accounts for a large portion of a person's income will be more elastic than a demand of a relatively inexpensive one. For example, a computer versus paper clips. It also depends on the number of alternatives. The fewer uses of a product has, the more likely the demand will be inelastic, like gasoline. And that finishes this podcast. Thank you.